Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and we're here to talk about how we're going to build a more empathic society. And I'm here with Elizabeth Segal. Did I pronounce it right?
Yes, yes.
Segal, yeah. So great. Well, thanks for joining me for this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to introduce you. I've got some notes here. First, you're a social policy analyst with a background in professional social work, and your current research is on social empathy. You know, how do you apply empathic insight into better social welfare policies and programs? And you've written over the years. You've written many academic papers, which I've read and really enjoyed reading. It's influenced my work on the topic of empathy. And you're also the author of a new book, Social Empathy, The Art of Understanding Others, and co-author of a more academic book, Assessing Empathy, and which you wrote with two other co-authors. And you've got a blog and a website at socialempathy.org. And I really enjoy your periodic articles that you put out. They're always very timely and related to current events that are happening around empathy. And I see that you're also working on a compendium of methods to teach social empathy and on some ways of measuring it. Is there anything else by way of introduction you'd like to say?
No, that's great. You really covered it.
Okay. Well, yeah, I just want to start off with, since you've been working on empathy for, quite some time, what the why of it? Why did you get started on working on this theme so, seriously and deeply?
Well, actually, I didn't know I was working on empathy originally. And about literally 20 years ago, when I was teaching, I have been teaching throughout my career public policy to social work students. And most social work students come in and are not exactly interested in public policy. So it was always a challenge. There's my dog. It's always a challenge to get them engaged. And so I would find ways to try to make it relevant to them. And what I found while teaching almost consistently is that there were some students who got it and some students who did it. And again, public policy feels very large and macro. So what I was trying to do is make it personal. What I discovered is that in spite of what may have been very good, compassionate, empathic feelings, some people were not able to share that in a larger scale. And that's what started me on trying to understand, why do some people understand empathy well in a personal way, and why do some people not get it in a larger way? And that's what started me on this journey to try to figure it out. And that's how I developed the concept of social empathy.
Oh, so it's you're saying that some of the students could sort of relate personally, empathically, and be sensitive, but when they were thinking of sort of macro policies, they just couldn't think of groups in an empathic way.
Exactly. And larger social issues, so that they might say, oh, I felt really bad when my friend got really sick and lost her job and she didn't have enough money and healthcare was a problem. And so we all rallied around her friends. We all brought dinners and helped her. And they got that. So then when I'd say, well, what about healthcare for all? Like, oh, well, not everybody, we're just talking about our friend. And it was very obvious that they could have very insightful feelings for someone they knew, but not somebody they didn't know, or groups they didn't know. And so, and that was always the case with issues like poverty. That seemed to be, I don't want to say always, but I mean, there were always students who just could not apply understanding and feeling what people were going through who they didn't know or didn't understand.
So is it you're wanting to foster like a broader vision of empathy? So trying to those students who didn't have that larger sense of empathy for the in the social context, you wanted to find ways of reaching them and
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
And I started trying to figure out, is it tolerance? Is it compassion? And I ended up thinking, well, I'm a social worker, so I was trained and understood the concept of empathy, but I never studied it deeply. And so what brought me into empathy was trying to figure this out. Then I discovered actually that because my background was strongly in public policy, I actually didn't understand empathy because almost all the literature at that time certainly was psychology.
Mm.
Although I had some background in that, I'm not a psychologist. So I actually engaged one of my colleagues, who I think you've interviewed a long time ago, Karen Gertis.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And who had a much stronger background in psychology as a social worker, as opposed to me. I had it in public policy, sociology. And we discovered all the emerging neuroscience, the cognitive neuroscience, which it was in its earliest stages, really. And so that set me on the path of studying, first, really learning about interpersonal empathy and understanding it psychologically as well as neurologically. And then going back to this concept I had of social empathy, but I needed first to learn about interpersonal empathy.
Mm-hmm. So it's really that neuroscience is kind of giving it that physiological or scientific basis.
I think so.
It's been a shift, yeah.
I mean, what it's done, and I've, at least in my reading of the literature, almost consistently is it's mapped brain paths that can be seen through the medical research of resonance, fMRIs, and seen the paths that our brains use to do skills or parts of empathy that psychologists have long thought existed, but couldn't see it. They watched people, but they couldn't see in their brain. So I found that fascinating, that there was this tremendous validation through the neuroscience of what psychologists had seen and monitored through observation.
Okay, so your motivation was, as I'm understanding it, is you're a social worker, you're wanting sort of social well-being, foster social well-being. You're seeing students who are able to connect kind of personally with, small groups. They're not able to connect to larger societal groups. And
Mm-hmm.
Then you're sort of on this journey to try to teach or have them learn about empathy. So how did that, you want to say more about the next steps that happened?
So that's
where you are today?
Set me on a different journey of research, but also, of reading, but also trying out, actually in developing instruments to measure interpersonal empathy. I had a wonderful team of colleagues, students and students who are now colleagues. And we did a lot in terms of trying to figure out what was the jumping off point from personal empathy to a larger scale. And we really discovered that there's two skills generally. The first is, they're both cognitive, they're both learned skills, but the first is understanding context. So we're always going to come across people that are different than us, and people who've experienced different things, even people we think are the same as we are because they might look like us, have had different experiences, but certainly people who don't look like us, who clearly have had different life experiences. There's a way to learn about their life experiences, in part from interacting and talking to them, but in large part from understanding context and historical context. And I realized that seemed to be the critical piece when I taught students. Okay, so you don't understand what it's like to be poor in a different community, in a different country, in a different racial or ethnic group. So how can you understand that? You might try to understand being poor in your own community, but how do you transfer it? And so it was really studying about context. So that was the first learned cognitive skill. The second cognitive skill that was necessary is to then really imagine yourself in that other person or in that other group's place. And that's not imagining yourself as if you are in their shoes, but imagine, you taking yourself into their situation, but that you literally live in their situation. So what would happen if one day you woke up and you were a different race, or you were a different gender, or you were a different sexual orientation, or had different physical abilities, and really lived that? And we know that's empathy, but it's empathy put on understanding a completely different context and a different culture, a different group life experience. And that's what social empathy. And when we do that, I think we have the ability to create better public policies, because we understand what people who are different than us need, not what we think we would need in their situation.
Okay, so maybe it'd be a good point to talk about what we mean by empathy. I'm still confused. It's so confusing. I've talked to, so many academics, and so forth, and they're all kind of using the word differently. Different
Sure.
fields are using it, kind of differently. There's the same term. It has multiple, definition words. It's like, I don't know. It's quite confusing. So how are you really defining it? Maybe we can kind of compare notes too, like how I've been saying. I talked to Dan Batson, who you probably know, I'm sure you know. He's studied empathy for like 40 50 years or whatever, and he wrote some good, I thought, papers on empathy, the definitions. He just lays out the different definitions of it, and he acknowledges it's very confusing, and he says the best thing you can do is have your definition and then stick to it, so people know what you mean by when you're talking about empathy.
Well, I think in general, I use the concept of feeling and understanding the feelings of other people's experiences. So it's sharing experience and understanding what that other person is going through in that experience. And then I divide it into interpersonal empathy, which is using those skills of understanding one-on-one, and then social empathy, using those skills to understand larger groups.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
But what I also feel is that why empathy is so complicated as a definition is that I think it can, so what we've worked on with my team is using the neuroscience and psychology and what we know about sociology as well as social workers. We've identified 7 skills, 5 of which make up interpersonal empathy, and an additional 2 that bring you further along into social empathy. And I've kind of talked about the 2 skills for social empathy. So I think that why empathy is so complicated is that there's an unconscious sort of foundation that triggers us, and then there's a cognitive, learned way of understanding that layers on top of that. And it's different skills that come together for the full array of empathy. The problem is some people write about only the physiological, unconscious piece and call that empathy, which in the literature, it's more often considered affective response. And then, or trait empathy, there's different ways that people use it. The cognitive parts are perspective taking and emotion regulation and self-other awareness. And those all together create empathy, which is why it's so difficult, because it's not just one very simple, plug this in and now you're empathic.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like an umbrella term. There's a lot of different components under that umbrella, and then it's like you need to sort of differentiate the different aspects of it.
And I think the advantage of the differentiation of the aspects is we can teach empathy in parts, so that, for example, affective response, that feeling you have that's unconscious. Somebody trips in front of you and you feel like you're falling, or someone yawns, and you yawn unconsciously. There are people, for example, survivors of traumatic post-traumatic stress syndrome, people who've survived traumatic events, particularly, for example, living through a war, have turned off a lot of those, have worked to turn off that affective response, because it overworks in traumatic or a war zone. You have to always be alert, but you can't live if you're constantly on the edge of total alertness. So you tamp it down, which would mean that somebody who was experiencing post-traumatic stress might need to work on opening up those feelings and letting them back out, while the rest of the parts of empathy may work fine. Whereas somebody who does that unconsciously but's never learned to walk in the shoes of another person or think about another person, you'd have to work with them on that. So by dividing the components, and you mentioned the first book that my team that I co-authored, and that was our scholarly look at all the components.
Okay, so for me, I'll just maybe share a little of how I'm seeing empathy. It starts, I think for me, I've been trying to define it in that it starts with the premise, and the premise is that we feel that as I go through life, I have felt bodily sensations, and even when I'm dreaming, I feel, right. I have feelings in my body, and I'm not quite sure what happens when I'm not dreaming. In that space, I think there's still felt experience. Like if somebody sticks a needle, in you, you're gonna wake up, or if there's a loud noise and you hear that. So we have the premise that we are feeling beings that have senses, and cold, warm, constricted, relaxed, etc. And there's a whole bunch of feelings, and that other people have feelings. So I have feelings, and other people have feelings. So I guess for me, the origination of empathy was in feeling, from the German. So it's the quality of feeling into my own experience of self-empathy. Like, what am I now? Am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling calm? Am I feeling curious? Am I feeling excited? So sensing into my own feelings, as well as feeling into someone else. And, you're across, I'm seeing your face, I'm seeing you nodding. I just see a little smile. I can sort of feel that little smile, and I can see the nodding. And so I can feel into your sense of sort of concentration and your sense of focus. I have a sense of that, and I can feel more into your experience. So that's sort of like an initial, and I can be conscious or, not conscious, totally aware of those feelings. And so that's what I would call empathy, is just feeling, into someone's experience. And we're doing it all the time. Like, we're just like, in that sense, we're sort of like a wash in empathy. It's like we're just empathizing all the time to varying levels and degrees. And it can be constricted, like you're saying, with the trauma. Somebody's trying to shut down their sense of awareness and feeling because it's just too much for them to take on or something. So that's kind of like the first step for me. I was just wondering how that resonates.
I think that's an important piece of it, and for most people, that's the beginning.
Yeah.
But I think that the difference between feeling someone else and empathy is taking it the step further and trying to understand what they're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes more cognitive. Because if we don't think about it, we're apt to respond like we would respond. So, most of us respond the same way if a needle sticks us in the finger, because that's got a physiological response. But someone may scream at whoever did it and say, "Why did you do that?" I mean, they may have a whole different response, and you may say, "Well, they did it because I'm sure there's a good reason, and I'll wait to see." And those are two different responses to the same physiological reaction. And if you respond differently than I do, my empathic insight is to try to figure out how we're different.
Mm-hmm.
You're responding the way you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say that we're sort of empathizing on an ongoing basis, sort of as a first step. But then the empathy is sort of feeling into, kind of going deeper behind. Perhaps it's sort of the process of going the deeper, maybe the feelings or the motivations or the needs or what are behind that. So it's sort of an in feeling process. as sort of the first part. And I think that's maybe sort of what they're calling affective, which, it's a bit of academic term, but
Yeah.
I like just sort of the empathy or feel. Yeah. So is that kind of, how does that?
Yeah, the problem that I always worry about is when we have those feelings, they become compassion, which is can be a positive feeling, but it gets confused as empathy, or sympathy gets confused as empathy, and those aren't.
Yeah.
Passion, I feel your pain, I feel your trauma or your travails, but I don't necessarily understand them. I may not even imagine what you're going through. And it can be rather hierarchical. Compassion is often, I'm in a good place, you're not. Same thing with sympathy. So I always worry when we think feeling for somebody and having feelings for them is always empathy, because it's not. Empathy is that next step of what are you going through?
Yeah, that's how I see it as well. Is it the sympathy, the perhaps compassion, the personal distress, all the various reactions that you may have can actually be a block to the empathy, right? If I'm trying to be present, this is like just typical, the core of like perhaps active listening in the therapeutic sense, like Carl Rogers and his work, being with the client, staying present with them, following them on their journey. If I suddenly am following you on your journey and then I say, oh, I feel so sorry for you, it's like I've gone to my journey. I'm no longer present with you. As well as if, hey, I'm on your journey, I'm getting frightened, then I'm like back onto my journey. And even terms like that's just, for example, the confusion, like you have like people are using the word empathic distress, but I wouldn't even say it might be something, a reaction that you have, but it's no longer empathy. It's like that, what they're calling, some people are calling empathic distress. I would just say it's just personal distress. It means you're not able to stay present in an empathic way with the other person. So, and there's so many different things that can kind of get you from being present with someone to being into your own journey. And so I think that's what you're addressing with the sympathy and the compassion. You're not staying present with the other person necessarily.
And the two components that we've identified is the idea that there's self-other awareness, that maintain this awareness that I'm experiencing your feelings, I'm sharing them, but they're your feelings.
Yeah.
Mine. And emotion regulation, which is obviously, if someone's sad and telling me a sad story, of course I feel sad. But the emotion regulation is built on that self-other awareness that I'm really sad for you, but I don't need to be paralyzed and in a state of sadness, which you might be in. Or it could be a good feeling, euphoria. It's not my euphoria. And so emotion regulation is a really critical skill that I realized in studying empathy with all my years of professional training. That probably was the piece that I never learned and didn't learn well in terms of empathy, is how to enter into someone's feelings like you're talking about and not be swept away and overwhelmed. And I think why people, this whole dark sides of empathy, in my opinion, is really not grappling with emotion regulation and blaming empathy for a skill that we need to have, which is distancing, not in a cold and uncaring way, but distancing ourselves, not to own, not to live someone else's emotions.
Yeah, that's exactly. I think those are these subtle kind of differences. They're huge at a visceral experiential level. They're big differences, but they kind of just get kind of mixed up in the different debates and discussions. And I think there's another part too with that self-other differentiation, is that I don't really know what people mean by empathy when they say you're feeling someone else's feelings. Like there is, as I understand it with the neuroscience and so forth, is that if I'm following your feelings, there are, my neurons are firing, feeling what it is that you're feeling. So it's sort of a mirroring, but there are other neurons that tell you that this is not your feeling necessarily, this is somebody else's feeling. So you don't feel the full experience of the other person's feeling. You're feeling like it's sort of contained with that self-other differentiation. There's actual neurons that help you do that, as well as like in the physical touch. There's sort of biology that actually supports that understanding.
And the biology is that the brain activity for self-other awareness it looks different than the mirroring. And so the mirroring of pain or of happiness or whatever it is. So that's exactly what it is that now that we know from neuroscience and cognitive brain imaging that indeed the brain, now they're milliseconds apart, it feels instantaneous to us, but they are different actions. And that means we need to learn different skills and put them together. That's why I think it's so complicated. I don't think empathy is one thing. I think empathy is a combination of several skills that when we develop all of them and we can call on all of them in a given time, I think you can be the most well-trained empath and have a bad day. You just feeling something. We all have days where it's hard to connect, and that's human and perfectly normal. So it's not a guarantee that you have to learn the skills, and two, that you can engage all of them at once all the time.
Yeah, you can be tired, you can be exhausted, and those type of things are going to affect, inhibit your empathy.
Yes.
And there's also this quality of, it seems that you can do these different qualities. Like, I can be empathizing with you, I can momentarily step into sympathy, but then come back to you. So you can have multiple aspects kind of happening, simultaneously too, kind of be going in and out. So it's not like, hey, I'm totally empathic with you. And it changes from moment to moment. And these feelings can seem to happen at the same time too. Like part of your brain is being very empathic and the other is kind of thinking, having thoughts, judgments or something that are kind of so it gets pretty complicated. And these complications seem to get glossed over in the typical, writings about it.
And I would add even more complication to it is that I can also choose to take action or not take action. I can truly imagine what you're going through, but then feel as if, or think through that a path of action that you might take is not appropriate. So I can, this is where we always think empathy means we're soft and compassionate and we let people do whatever they need to do because we're being empathic. And that's not true at all. Empathy is the tool to understand why they're doing something, but we are free to make suggestions, not make any suggestions, support actions, disagree with actions. Those are separate. And I think we often lump together into empathy the actions that we might take as a result of that. Now, we do know, and Daniel Batson's work is very clear on this, that aroused senses of empathy do lead to typically pro-social behavior, and we have altruism, and we have lots of good things that come out of empathy. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that. It's nuanced.
Yeah. And then there's also the quality of, if you start feeling sympathy, the action might be an action based on what would be good for you.
Exactly.
It's like you're not really solving the other, and that's like, a lot of the charity work and so forth is people like in developing countries or even with the poor, it's like, oh, I'm helping you, but I'm really just trying to solve my own distress. And there's no longer a presence, like a co-design of in addressing the real problem. For example, You know, I'll share a problem I'm having with someone, and they'll go right to advice, want to advise me on what to do. And I get so irritated with that because, one, they're not even seeing the real problem. They haven't given time and space for me to really get to the core of the problem that I'm having. And so they're kind of like solving their own problem, you know, in their own head, but not really, you know, having seen what the real problem is. So there's kind of those nuances as well.
And in public policy, unfortunately, we see that a lot. So, for example, I'm thinking of a particular example. I was lucky enough to travel to South Africa and visit a lot of communities. And one of the villages that the people, I was with a foundation, and they worked with lots of villages and lots of particularly AIDS orphans. But they were one of the villages we visited. They showed me on the top of the hill this beautiful health clinic, and they told me this great classic story. The community needed health care. There was no doubt about it, and that was a good thing to build a clinic. But these charitable groups from outside forgot one important thing, and that was to include community members. And I know that for a lot of us who do community work and who infuse it with social empathy, well, like, duh, you would include the community groups. But they missed that point, and somehow in the building of it, with all these white people building this clinic, the community thought it was something different than what it was, and were very frightened of it. And so here they spent all this money. Now the first reaction was, these people don't use it, what's wrong with them? They don't understand the need for healthcare. And so they were blaming the community. When they finally did a little research and were open to it and discovered that their mistake, they brought in the medicine doctors, the medicine people from the community, asked them to visit, get engaged, hold their ceremonies at the clinic, and in no time, you know, and then eventually the clinic became exactly what it was built to be. But they didn't get buy-in because they didn't walk in the shoes of other people. They thought they did. They were building something useful. So that's that first part you were talking about. Oh, this is what the problem you're having. I understand that problem. But then they didn't walk in their shoes. They didn't actually imagine what the folks for whom they wanted to build this clinic would need, feel, want. And of course, had they involved them, they might have even designed it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That can be done. But from public policy, that happens. That's a concrete example in your country, but I can find you oodles of examples in our country of how, I mean, right now, the treatment of children, immigrant children, refugee children at the border, there's no parent, I believe, involved in public policy that would want his or her own child to be living like that. I think if you could tell them that's your child, they would change the policy. The problem is they don't see these children as those like their own children. And so that's a huge breakdown in empathy. And in social empathy, it has significant implications in creating very punitive and horrible policies.
Well, there is that there in the human-centered design community, which is a very design-oriented process. They have something called Codesign, where you work together with people you're designing for. It's not just the designer seeing the other as sort of somebody we're designing for, but really listening, mutually listening, and having those dialogues and that sort of a mutual, dialogue back and forth to sort of integrate the different ideas and views to come up with something sort of like a empathic action, maybe.
Yes.
that there's an action where we're both working together. And I see that in mediation, in conflict mediation. I think there's sort of an arc in conflict mediation that, people are totally pissed off with each other, barely talking. You bring them together, maybe the mediator empathizes with each side to get them to start feeling heard and seen, and then starts trying to get them to empathize with each other, with whatever practices, empathic listening or whatever. They start understanding each other, and then you have the question is, well, what are we going to do now? And one person suggests, well, what if we get together at a cafe every week to talk about these issues? And then the other person says, well, that works with me. How about 10 o'clock in the morning and says, oh, I can't do 10 o'clock. How about 2 o'clock? And then they sort of negotiate, co-design and negotiate, and everyone has a voice, and you just kind of move forward. And it seems like the same arc I just see in kind of in a larger sense with public policy or anything, if there's that co-design aspect.
And with it, what you're describing is the process of getting to know the other person while you're so co-designing in theory fits, but in reality creates different pathways to connect people, so that the us-them divide or the me-you divide becomes us, and we get to know each other. So that's part of also empathy, that we know from lots of good research that it's harder to empathize with someone who's different than you. And that's part of it, is that they're unknown, we don't know them, we put up sort of barriers because they're different than us. And so ironically, the kind of code, of co-designing has this also has the effect of bridging differences, because you want to meet in the afternoon, I want to meet in the morning, you like coffee, I like tea. We start to become friends in that regard when we're really working on this project. And that's what is much harder to do on large scale. It's, it's hard enough to do one-on-one.
Yeah.
And to do it with groups, it becomes very difficult. But working on tasks and co-designing is a great way for groups to work together.
Well, I did want to go back just to, that the things that block empathy, and you had sort of hinted, like, I think it was towards some criticisms, the dark side of empathy. And one of the critics of empathy is Paul Bloom, and you've written a response to him, in that there is that difference there of what he is criticizing is, if I'm listening to you, I'm following you on your journey, I'm sort of empathizing with you, and then and then you go into tears or you get into anger, and then whatever really strong emotion that you have, his definition of empathy is that, well, he goes into that. So you're getting angry, I get angry, sort of match your state in full body, or you go into tears. And, he talks about going to his therapist. He doesn't want to go to his therapist, where if he's in tears, that his, therapist goes into tears too. So I think that's a real important part of that self-other differentiation, and the difference between staying with someone on their journey versus, and these are subtle things that it's easy to confuse. Like, when
and I think he's confused. Those examples are confusing emotional contagion with empathy. That when I match your emotions in a way that is not my emotions anymore, all I've done is mirrored you, and it's emotion contagion, as opposed to empathy, which requires that these are your feelings, self-other awareness, and also emotion regulation. And one thing we know, and some research that we did on social work practitioners, the most senior practitioners reported the highest levels of emotion regulation. So the longer they stayed in the profession, the better they got. So Bloom is absolutely right. You don't want a therapist crying when you start crying. You want a therapist to feel you are crying and understand why you're crying, and to work with you in that regard, but not fall apart and just be a mirror image. And good therapists don't. I mean, they know about regulation. They learn it. And so that's real empathy, not emotion contagion.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's, in fact, what he's describing as a criticism of empathy is something that blocks empathy. So it's like, that just adds to this total, trying to get, these are subtle things to kind of get across, but they're huge. And the visceral body, the experience of it is people really sense the difference between being empathized with and being sympathized with. I mean, especially in these fields, like in the therapeutic world, I've got a lot of experience with this.
saying that's attributed to Maya Angelou. People don't remember what you say, but they remember how you made them feel. And I think that's what empathy is, that it's how you respond to them, not what you. So back to your example where you haven't, you're troubled by something, and then the person starts giving you advice.
Yeah.
You didn't hear them at all, but you certainly felt they're not hearing you, and so you remember.
Yeah. Yeah, you feel that disconnection, that alienation. So yeah, it's strong. Yeah.
Which is not to say that if somebody were deeply empathic, they could also give advice. That could be the action that you take. But you're more likely to hear their advice if you felt, so you're more likely to heed their advice if you feel heard and understood.
Yeah, and it's also there's in the therapy. I mean, there's a lot of the work, in the therapeutic world. They've had a lot of time and to really study this. Is that there comes a time when you're sort of open. At first, you just want a sense of connection. You want a sense of being heard and understood, and then you're inviting advice instead of it being kind of pushed on you, and you kind of are open and ready and receptive for it. And that's another part of empathy, is being sensitive to knowing when that time is there, even with the other person sort of requesting it. That, okay, I feel heard, I'm open for some ideas. And so, that's another sort of a subtle piece to it. So the other thing is, in terms of the definitions, we're going really into definitions here. I really appreciate the nuances that you have of understanding really what's happening with empathy. Is something that's called the cognitive empathy, and I really dislike the term cognitive. It just seems like it's come out of the academic, the neuroscience, whatever. And with the term I like is imaginative empathy. I think it's sexier. Is that, so I'm wondering what you think about this, is that as human beings, we have the ability to take on roles. We can take on, I can imagine being you. I can, like Meryl Streep, I can imagine, she imagines being, Julia Child or Margaret Thatcher or whoever. And she sort of really embodies the role, takes it on, and just has it, really. And so that's another part of empathy, is that we can imagine ourselves in any person's role and feel into the experience of, and I see this in mediation too. That when we do mediation training, that people take on the role of someone who's perhaps not in the mediation. Like if there's a family dispute, the father isn't, able to take part, and then the facilitator takes on the role of the father, and you just hear a little bit of the father. He's, very introverted, he's very strict, and then you just take on that role, and it's amazing how that person stands in for that person. So that seems to be the other aspect of, instead of just feeling into someone else's experience, we can sort of take on this imaginative empathy role. And we can actually take on the role of anything. Like you can be an animal, you can be a carrot, you can be a turnip. I mean, it's like, I think Einstein, imagined himself being a beam of light, what would happen if, I'm this beam of light. So that's, I just wondered how that resonates. What do you think about that?
Well, I think of the cognitive empathy as thinking. And it's the part of empathy also that I see as teachable. I mean, I can teach someone, help someone to recognize their physiological reactions, but that happens unconsciously. So back to what we were talking about, the part of, if someone hits you and you're feeling pain, my brain will imagine as if I'm feeling pain, totally unconsciously. That's the affective part. The cognitive empathy piece is what they call cognitive empathy, I think, are the thinking parts that I imagine, which is imagination. To imagine what it's like to be you, I have to use my thinking parts of my brain. Wow, what would it be like to be in his shoes? What would it be like if that happened to me? What if I were in that place or time? And so I consider it feeling and thinking. So the affective is the feeling and the cognitive is the thinking. And so role playing is a very specific training we do to get people to think like others. Now, where it's complicated, back to what we were talking about, they're almost instantaneous. And remember, if I start thinking, you know, if I imagine, okay, I'm the angry father or the introverted father or the whatever, I start to physically do that. So it's a sort of a feedback loop of I'm mirroring something that I imagined so that I'm getting into the part, which is why many actors will say it's exhausting to play that part because you've literally immersed yourself physically as well as mentally, emotionally, cognitively. So I don't think there's affective empathy and cognitive empathy as two separate things, but I do think there's affective and cognitive parts that come together to make empathy. Is that?
Yeah, I guess there's every word has different meanings. So even thinking, what is it? Like, for example, one thing I try to do is like define it in terms of what we're doing here. Like, where are we thinking? Like in the moment, like, you know, where is the thinking happening? Like kind of moving my hands, you're sort of feeling into the energy of that. Like, yeah.
Well, so a lot of it is been going on for us since we were children, since we were very young. So it doesn't feel cognitive thinking like, okay, I have to study for this exam. I got to open this book and study. That's thinking. It's not quite that obvious anymore but for people who are learning to be empathic, who maybe missed out on it, they have to actively say, okay, what if I were in your shoes? I think for a lot of us who've been studying empathy, we're probably interested in studying it for years because we've been probably higher on an empathic scale. We've responded, we've felt people's things, we're like, what's going on? Why do I feel other people's feelings all the time? So it's been something that feels innate, but I would argue, and I try to think back to my childhood and watching other children growing up and raising children and watching how there's little things that happened when we're growing up that taught us the cognitive thinking, imaginative part of empathy as almost a normal, as almost an unconscious part. So, you know, think back to that time when at some point when we were children, or I've watched with children I've worked with, you know, where they hit another child and the adult response might be, imagine if you were the one getting hit, how would you feel? And they have to really work at that. Like, someone could hit me. I mean, it literally is teaching perspective taking. And if you learn that at a very young age, it becomes second nature. So you think it's this whole feeling thing. But I honestly believe it's a cognitive training that we learned at a very young age.
Yes, this is where things start getting complicated for me, because it seems that even empathizing into someone else's experience, as we were talking, so the feeling into, is cognitive. If cognitive is sort of happens in the brain, is neurons sort of moving and connecting. And so it kind of gets like differentiating, like where is the difference between just sensing into and, you know, real, I don't know, I kind of struggle with it.
It's the continuum of unconscious to conscious. Maybe that's a better way of thinking of it. At some point, we're triggered initially, often unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I didn't know you knock on my door because you're having a bad day. I didn't even know you were coming over. I don't know you're sad, but I see this look in your face and you start to cry or tell me something. So the unconscious kicks in right away, right? That's the beginning of this continuum. And then, I mean, even a stranger, I can see they're having a bad day. I start unconsciously feeling it. Then we move into the conscious, which is more, and some of us do it faster and easier and don't, I mean, but I mean, even with all my research and my working on empathy, I often have, like, I'll have young colleagues who'll say to me, that really you know, we are in a meeting and they'll say, what that person said really offended me. And I'll think that I'm empathic and I'm understanding and I'm reading people. And I didn't pick it up because I didn't sit in her shoes at that moment. So that's really conscious, where I have to be told what someone else experienced. And I think that a lot of us do that willingly because we've been on that continuum and we don't feel it's as abrupt. But for some people who aren't used to tuning into other people, when you call them on tuning into other people, it's very abrupt to them and very difficult. And that's to them sort of, I worry that's interpreted sometimes as the dark side of empathy. You're making me cry like you and get all emotional. No, I'm asking you to understand me, which this one's really difficult for me to explain. But the idea of a continuum,
Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a continuum of empathy from sort of a not consciously aware, not having it kind of, not having a model, maybe the relationships, sort of a mental model of relationships. You're just experiencing to having a bigger mental model. Would that?
Yes, and I think that I would not, and along the way, the mirroring can be just simply emotion contagion. Like if you don't travel down the continuum, you run the risk of having other things happen, like emotion contagion, emotional responses, and that you need to go into that cognitive level. And so because social empathy involves understanding groups and public policy, there's a heavy cognitive component.
Yeah.
You really have to think through, I will never be a pregnant teenager living in a poor, impoverished neighborhood where there's dangers. I mean, time has passed me by. I'm never going to be that. I never was that. That takes a lot more cognitive thinking. I need to learn about the context. It's not just enough to share that young pregnant teenage girl's feelings, scared, confused. I need to understand the whole context, and that's much more farther along a continuum of cognitive processing.
Mm-hmm. So that's what you're meaning by social empathy, sort of creating a larger context of all the different factors and how those factors are interrelating and connecting with each other. So you sort of create this, I've heard the term mental models used, just or a map, I guess, could be of the whole territory of how it's. And so how do you create those models? Is that sort of?
Yes, because particularly in public policy, the people who pass policy tend to be more powerful. That's why they're elected to do that. They also, because they are in public policy positions that give power and require power to get there, not all of them, but the vast majority of them have not had the life experiences of the people for whom they're passing policies. So a big disconnect right there of empathy. And how do you, and then, so that's part A. Then part B is when you get them to try to think about what it would be like to be that other person, you have to also get them to park what they would do, because the way that they grew up was so different. You can't assume that your behaviors are the correct behaviors because you had a whole set of circumstances that brought you to this time and place. So people in making public policy are often way off base in terms of experience about the policies for whom they're making them.
Mm-hmm. So they're in sort of their context. You can see it as sort of a bubble, right? They're in their context bubble, and there's the person that they're making policy has their own context bubble.
Right.
How do you really understand those context bubbles and sort of have them sort of integrate?
Well, and especially since the policymaker's context bubble has lots of power, and the person for whom they're making the policy doesn't. Don't have the options to make the policy or change it. So there's a responsibility in that as well.
Yeah. So it's like the effect of power in terms of understanding other people. So if you have your context, you know what it's like to have all this power, and that kind of affects your sort of actions. And what does it feel like to have like no or little power? And it's maybe hard to really kind of grasp that or feel it or sense
on
it.
top of that, the research on power and empathy is that power actually blocks empathy. Because on the one hand, if you're in charge, if you felt every single person's working for you or constituent of yours, if you walked in their shoes, you'd be overwhelmed. So there is an element of people in power have to sort of park some of their, or compartmentalize some of their empathy to get things done. But when they do that, they run the risk of not understanding the people for whom they're making policies.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I feel like we barely touched the surface here. I could talk, I think, for the next 8 hours on.
Well, considering the work you've done, Edwin, you could talk about this for many hours straight. And I understand it. Me too.
Yeah, I had wanted to go into the training aspect. Maybe we'll do another. How do you learn and practice and deepen? Maybe we can do another discussion. On that if you've got time, because I really appreciate and enjoy the nuance. There's all these little nuances, and people haven't studied it. They kind of get mushed together, and all this stuff has to be sort of taken apart to look at the differences, and it has huge impact. There's like the whole Paul Bloom, criticisms of empathy. Is it has an impact on people when they see these books against empathy. There's a new one coming out, the Shadow Side, Dark Side. I'm going to interview him too, so maybe we can even. I do something called empathy circles, which I find is a really good sort of core practice. It's mutual active listening. So perhaps we could do an empathy circle with Fritz, I think is his name, from the Shadow Side, if you're interested in that. So I'm kind of rambling here because, anyway, we'd love to, continue the conversation if you've got time at another time. Maybe we just talk about, we've got an introduction sort of the definition, beginning here, maybe a topic on what are the ways of training, teaching, and deepening.
And I think that empathy is a relatively new area of study. I mean, when you consider the fact that even the term didn't show up till a little over 100 years ago. And I appreciate the work that the Empathic Civilization, Rifkin's book, that we were evolving in that way. I think that we're probably in the, I don't know about infancy, but maybe the adolescent stage of understanding empathy. We have a lot more to go. So, and one of the big areas is also how do we teach empathy, which we're talking about. That we're just starting to work on to really try to figure that out. I mean, we have a lot of research out there and a lot of ideas, but it's not that easy, but it's important.
Yeah, but there's real tangible benefits. Like, we do empathic listening. We have this empathy tent. We go into public. We do mediation. We listen to people. Right. There is real visceral, felt positive outcomes that happen, and that's why I'm so dedicated to this, And
I share that because the best public policies that I've ever studied and I, in U.S. history are ones that are made through empathic insight. Those are good public policies. So there's a lot riding on it in a macro sense as well.
Oh, and in terms of, there's this Extinction Rebellion movement. I don't know if you've heard of it. They're out of the UK. They've been doing social actions to raise the level of awareness of climate change. And so they're sort of like Occupy Wall Street 2.0, and it's just starting up and it's kind of spreading around the world. And I'm sure you'll hear more about it in the fall because there'll be a lot of social actions. So we started doing empathy circles with them, and just about seeing if we can bring empathy circle practice into that movement. So perhaps we could do another discussion just on training, because I think this is really the steps of how do we move these practices forward into the culture.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been really exciting and
well, thank
fun.
you. Thank you
Yeah.
for inviting me, and thank you for engaging in such a great conversation. It's always interesting to think about it because it's so hard. It helps to conceptualize and solidify ideas. So thank you.